My bachelor degree is in jazz piano performance and music theory, and I was a jazz musician, actually, professional jazz musician when I became a Christian, and so jazz has deep roots in me, and that's what I'll be thinking about with all of you today. The Doctrine of Creation, according to Ashford and Bartholomew and the Kuyperian tradition that they represent, celebrates the materiality of creation and locates in it a spirituality as inherent to Christianity as that most often thought of in prayer and fasting. This view conveys music in ways contiguous with thinkers like Harold Best, who sees music as a combination of beauty and truth, which humans should embrace at different levels. With regard to Ashford and Bartholomew's ideas as they apply to jazz, I think jazz provides a good exemplar or microcosm of the author's neo-Calvinist view of creation. Section 1, can anything good come from NOLA? NOLA, for those of you who are uninitiated, is New Orleans, Louisiana. Or Irenaeus would have loved Monk. Jazz music is American at its core, and by some counts, the only uniquely American art form that we've ever provided the world. Jazz's central place in American and world music legitimates its analysis in light of Ashford Bartholomew's Doctrine of Creation. Richard Weaver's Platonic claims concerning jazz provides us with a tangible antagonist for our author's book. They are as follows. First, jazz disdains order and structure. Second, the virtuosity of jazz solos embrace individualization and egotism. And lastly, jazz expresses itself only in the sexual and the farcical. First, Weaver argues that jazz evinces a rage to divest itself of anything that suggests structure or confinement, end quote, reducing jazz to basically an emotional explosion of reasonless movements on instruments. However, far from feigning order and structure, jazz actually reflects creation in its balanced commitment to order and creativity rather than uniformity. Our authors quote Kuyper, where in God's entire creation do you encounter life that does not display the unmistakable hallmark of life? Precisely in the multiplicity of its colors and dimensions, in the capriciousness of its ever-changing forms, end quote. Jazz reflects creation's deep creativity in its ever-changing forms, its multiplicity of colors and dimensions, and yet still avoids Weaver's accusations of absurdity. Concerning this creational type order, Wynton Marsalis notes that jazz musicians embrace the equilibrium inherent to the notes one might play over against the economy of the notes one does play. They simultaneously craft space for other instruments and determine how to move in time with one another, while also individually moving against, behind, or in front of the time. Point of fact, jazz musicians live and die on a rigid sense of harmonic location and time. Dropping time is the unforgivable sin in jazz. Thus, while classical music reproduces previous profound thoughts and choral music in look and sound emphasizes conformity, jazz portrays creation's dynamic colors and dimensions, moving from structure to spontaneity and back to structure, engineering a communal creativity that insists upon unity rather than uniformity, each voice expressing itself and the thoughts and feelings of the entire group without divesting itself of order. Second, Weaver eschews improvisational virtuosity as egotism or individualization. He callously attributes jazz solos to the spontaneity of the Negro, end quote, and, quote, declining faith in the value of culture of the Western man, end quote. However, in the jazz solo, one finds the inadvertent, though perhaps providential, impulse that mimics, though loosely, our author's sense of creational movement, in which the end returns to the beginning and is yet at the same time the apex, in which is exalted high above the origin. Jazz soloists inadvertently reflect the biblical commission to have dominion over creation by acting as craftsmen in its midst. Our authors note that creation has built-in potentialities that God intends for his imagers to bring to fruition. One might suggest that jazz could be understood as a microcosm of how our authors discuss common grace in every sphere. Each solo reflects an expanded musical vocabulary, syntax, and structure. Throughout the history of the discipline, as jazz solos became longer, the best soloists would implant a familiar melody into their solo to give listeners something tangible to grip. The creative imprint of jazz soloing feigned egotism, and rather expressed the tangible, familiar, even the embraceable. Contrary to Weaver's understanding of jazz as the product of the noble savage, clearly establishing a hierarchy between ethnicities, the Doctrine of Creation provides an egalitarian human vision that would pursue an attentiveness to beauty, rhythm, melody, and harmony, that when taken seriously produces more rather than less sophistication. Weaver claims that jazz's appeals lies in titillation, and its themes often reflect the sexual and the farcical, appealing to the, quote, lower rather than higher sinners so that it fails to raise us to our metaphysical dream, end quote. For him, Mozart is actually the perfect exponent of music that emphasizes social order and presumably avoids the lack of morality inherent to jazz. One should raise an eyebrow to anyone utilizing Mozart as a keeper of the moral high ground. However, that said, this particular criticism does allow us to address the idolatry potentially inherent to jazz. Concerning idolatry and culture in general, Ashford Bartholomew write, quote, sin therefore has massive and deleterious consequences on humanity's cultural life. Since humankind's fall, the center of each culture is found in some form of communal idolatry that shapes all aspects of social and cultural life and organizes them in rebellions to God. This community idolatry works itself out through the very imaging capacities that were meant for worshipful culture making. Thus, as far as the image of God extends to human nature and is reflected in the cultural activities of humans in God's creation, so sin pervades every element of it. Nothing is left untouched by sin. Jazz culture, like all cultures on this side of Genesis 3, tends toward the creature rather than the creator, placing the weight of judgment and prudence on the Christian listener. For us to listen to Charlie Parker, Mozart, Chris Stapleton, the Beatles, or Kendrick Lamar, one must listen with eschatological and redemptive responsibility. Here, even the music that falls short of our gospel shape and ambitions still may bear beautiful traces and possibilities, and they're echoes of a greater song still. One must learn to navigate such music rather than vilify it or blindly accept it. Ashford Bartholomew's Doctrine of Creation insists upon a determined wisdom in social engagement. They suggest, in fact, that engaging creation at present often means one must excavate the idolatrous underpinnings of every endeavor and then redirect the endeavor toward Christ and his glory. Such an act previews final restoration and imbibes current playing and listening with a significant optimism that shapes creational reception as a good thing rather than something to be eschewed. This approach recognizes the beauty in Gil Evans and Miles Davis's paradigm-shifting discography in the 1960s, Chick Corea's Spain, or John Coltrane's Giant Steps, is no less spiritual than a mid-shelf attempt to simply arrange the hymn Amazing Grace into a jazz tune. The consistency of jazz with Ashford Bartholomew's Doctrine of Creation is that it admits to the holistic person in both soul and body. The sensual does not have to be bad, and in fact is not. As our authors contend throughout their work, biblical tradition cannot conceive of the divestment of body from the soul, spirit, and the intellect. Deuteronomy notes that the highest form of covenant obedience is, in fact, a holistic adoration toward God, and then legislates throughout for a holistic care and concern for those around you. Song of Songs echoes the same concept, celebrating an uninhibited sexual engagement in the bounds of covenantal commitment. I'm not arguing that jazz is Christian here. Viewing jazz through a Kuyperian lens would certainly indicate that it, like Mozart, can lead one to imagine the sovereignty of the creation rather than the creator. However, due to the strength of jazz music's latitude and depth, the doctrine of creation, the Christian listener can listen and hear the wisdom and beauty of the creator in jazz without worshiping the creature that provides it. In fact, as our authors contend, creation's goodness frames the goodness of each cultural domain and sphere, then jazz embodies creational goodness in a rather unique manner. Kuyper notes, God invests his creation with hidden cultural potential and calls image bearers to actualize them. So even while sin exploited the fragility of creation and of humanity, it could not erase all the structural and normative goodness of things like jazz music. Though like all music, jazz practitioners lean away from the creator to enjoy and adore the creature. It, like all music, will one day experience both restoration and renewal along with creation in the finished work of the triune God. Thanks.